Please feel free to move around a little bit if it's easier to see or hear or more comfortable. Stretch your legs. So this morning I'd make some time for question and response. And I gotta say, I get so frustrated about many things. Sorry, long-term meditation doesn't necessarily take care of that. It might, but and one of them is these days it's very common for people to say, as if it's just a fact of the matter, that religion is dogmatic and that religion has caused all these problems because people, once they believe in a religious tradition, then they don't think for themselves. I've not found that to be true in this tradition, and in fact, many people I know who are religious who are not in this tradition, that's not true at all. But it seems to be kind of a thing that gets repeated again and again. And I don't think the way to remedy that is to argue with people who say that, but it is to live our life without the kind of constrictions of thinking that religion and thinking deeply and creatively and freely are at odds with each other. Have they been at odds with each other? Are they ever at odds with each other? Sure. But take just about anything, and you can find that also to be true. Even now, as much as we champion science and so many wonderful things that come from a scientific mindset, there's a lot of rigidity in much approach to science that we have as well. So we can find rigidity anywhere. I guess that's my main point. Religion has not been a stranger to that rigidity, but religion also has a deep currents of creativity. This particular tradition, the Zen tradition, or we're in a school called the Soto Zen tradition, it is absolutely vital in this tradition that we keep our hearts and minds and lives free, in the sense that we're not free just to like impose our desire to think a certain thing or live a certain way on the world. But that's not what I mean by freedom. That's actually kind of the opposite of freedom. But the freedom to inquire, to look more deeply into things, to take what we know and then say, where else could I go from there? And in our tradition, that's enshrined within this kind of pervasive facet of our tradition in asking questions. And there's a great freedom in asking a question, and there's a great freedom in responding to a question. And it's where a lot of vitality comes from the Zen tradition as a whole. If we talk about what is correct, like people rail against orthodoxy, ortho means correct, and in Chinese, that character is say, anyway, it doesn't matter so much what it is, but it gets used. But it gets used in a really different way. So like in our tradition, we talk about the true Dharma I, or the treasury of the true Dharma I. That true, you could say, the treasury of the orthodox I, or you could say the ortho I. I don't know what I is in Latin. Does anyone know? Something that comes. Huh?
Optic?
Optic? Ortho-optic? Maybe that's what it is. Anyway, correct way of seeing, the correct capacity to see, the consciousness which sees with the clarity of a Buddha. So we use that term, but the first place that term ever showed up was in a sermon that had no words. Shakyamuni Buddha, one day sitting in front of the assembly and preparing to give a teaching, picked up a flower and twirled it between his forefinger and thumb. And one of his very close friends, Mahakashapa, said to smile. And the Buddha said, Mahakashapa, I entrust to you the true Dharma I, or the treasury of the true Dharma I. The wondrous mind of Nirvana. Also use those terms. So that's the kind of interaction in which true comes up in, right? It's a dynamic interaction. I'll say one more thing, then I'll take your questions. You're probably thinking of some now. I'm starting to prepare for the lecture series this fall. I'll give I don't know, is it 10, maybe 10 lectures on a text called Jiju Zanmai, which is by a teacher in our tradition named Menzan, who lived in the 18th century. He was kind of revivalist of the Soto Zen school and that period of Tokugawa Japan. And he wrote a lot. Most of what he wrote was on monastic regulations and institution building and those kinds of things. But he also wrote a lot a lot of ritual manuals and some of these teachings. And this particular teaching is really powerful. So anyway, look forward to that this fall on Thursday evenings if you're interested. But so I was doing a little research and I read this sweet little snippet, Menzan, again, with his teacher whose name is escaping me right now, and they're sitting eating melon. This is a good sign. And they said, oh, the melon is so sweet. And his teacher says, oh, Menzan, why is the melon sweet? And Menzan says, it is because of causes and conditions that comes together, and then the melon becomes sweet. And his teacher kind of, and he says, well, you asked me. And so this often is the pattern, right? And then the student asks, so Menzan asks his teacher, says, well, why is the melon, no, sorry, it's not why is the melon sweet. Where's the sweetness of the melon come from? Okay. That's the phrase. Where does the sweetness of the melon come from? It comes from causes and conditions. Because you asked me, and he says, where's the sweetness of the melon come from? And his teacher says, the where itself. The where itself is where the sweetness comes from. Just think about that for a second. How we always treat question mark things as the lead up to the answer, right? The where. Right away your brain's like, where? Tell me where, right? And his teacher has a different answer. He says, no, the where itself. The where itself is where the sweetness comes from. This openness, this receptivity, this capacity to encounter melon, that is where the sweetness comes from, not from some object of sweetness that's outside of your heart and mind, right? Oh, I read that. It's just almost wrote it on the front case, but I had a poem from my friend. Please, everyone, look at that. I promise I'll stop talking. Out on the little case, me or someone else will do a little writing, and we put it out there. Try to change it once a month or so. It seems like it's once every couple months these days. But this is a poem from my good friend Mark Keene, who passed away last year in August, and so I wanted to put it up for the month of August. And he was probably the bravest person I've ever met. He was diagnosed with ALS about a decade ago. He wasn't expected to live for more than 4 or 5 years, and he lived for, I think, about 11. And he went in with a totally straight eye. Unbelievable. So this is a poem from, I think he wrote this poem while he was in the end days. Only his eye movements. He had a kind of computer, and he had a very faint eye movement in which he could pick out letters. So this was a poem that he wrote, I believe, at that time. Anyway, when you read it, it's good to know some context about his life. Okay. What's shaking? Not to avoid the fear or the sorrow. It's one way we can think of, if I think about Mark, and I think, he went straight in, and we didn't remain so close while he was going through that process. So I don't know a lot of how it all went, but he was diagnosed just as his daughter was born. So that whole process of the disintegration of his being as we would know it, kind of conventional way, I got the sense that he just never avoided the pain or sorrow, and that allowed him to be clear about the wholeness of it, as opposed to death usually divides us, and then that's where the pain comes.
Do you mean divides us in ourselves?
And outside, the heart, as the heart is divided, the world's divided. The world's divided into the dead and the living. Our heart's divided into, those that we can cherish and those that we've lost. And in that division, we suffer. And there's another possibility, which is not to close the door between life and death, or to close the door between those we can hold in a physical sense and those which we have to hold in another sense. That I is what we're trying to care for in our practice. It's not just that we're like shining up the lenses, although that's part of it, right? You know, we're trying to get clearer and by not being so confused. So we do some wiping, but really that's not the whole job, to wipe the lenses off. The job is to be amazed by what it is that we meet, regardless of the circumstance.
What's, I feel like I have some understanding of closing the door between the living and the dead.
Yeah.
That might sound
Yeah.
But what is it like? Is it like what's inside? Like not closing the door inside is not closing the door inside like not closing the door between the living and the dead.
Yeah. And if you think about how, just for us to be able to meet, then there has to be something in what I call me that is receptive to your being, and in you there has to be something in you which is receptive to my being, and in that receptivity we both we can encounter. That receptivity need not end, and yet we think of all kind of reasons to end it. Death is a really straightforward one. I don't mean, like so challenging, but we shut it down. We're so practiced at shutting it down. Like my wife came back from the market yesterday with peaches. If you ever need a little spiritual uplift this time of year, I encourage you, go to a place with good peaches and get just one peach, right? But don't squeeze it. You won't want to, right? Because you'll want to get the best peach. And as you want to get the best peach, all of the peaches become the kind of like victims of your appetite. She said she was at the peach guy at the market, and he was a little bit grumpy. And I was like, if I sold peaches, I would be so grumpy. I would have a sign, don't touch the peaches. I will pick the peaches for you. Anyway, go get a peach. But think about what happens. You peel that peach and you eat the peach, and all of the ways in which you could leverage that situation to try to make the peach be something like that you've made concrete in your imagination beyond the peach itself. You don't really become receptive to the peach. You're just trying to inflict your desire on the peach, which is really easy to do because it's a peach. And but here you have this other option, which is just like peach. And the flesh is so receptive to your mouth. And your mouth can be so receptive to it. But we tend to, peach, they're so delicious. Boom. Now the peach becomes an object among objects. And we're so practiced at that then when it comes to something like death, the fear and pain of it will shut the door. Like, we're so practiced at shutting the door. So a lot of what we're doing in our practice is just, how do we stay receptive? How do we exercise that receptivity, which is is very direct. And all we can do is kind of put it at the center and keep walking around it and failing, but falling into its gravity again and again.
Well, Joe,
Hi.
this is exactly the question I was going to ask on the topic. So I read this, so it could definitely be wrong, because you know my reading. So if I'm wrong, please correct me. But this is what I think that I might have read. So Bodhidharma and Dogen and others have mentioned, so on the topic of birth and death, Dogen, I think, said that the mistake of thinking that we are alive and dead was the problem. He said that birth has its own death, right? And death has its own birth and death. And the problem is that if we think they both are coexist, there's no Buddha. Right? And then to understand the separation from them two and understand that they both have their own existence, then Buddha nature is here. Can you explain more on that?
You're not a plant for June's talk next week, right? So June is going to talk about this exact thing next week. So I'm not going to go on too much about it, but just to say two things. One is there's no right and wrong in what you read or understand.
Yeah.
there is reading, there's understanding, there's exploring, there's questioning, and there's going beyond what we have understood. And you're doing that. So there's no need to be like a right or wrong, or to be affirmed in being right, or to be negated in being wrong. And the terrain that you're walking in there is a very fertile field of exploration. So, you know, Dogen says, just how you said it, you know, death is its own position in time. Life is its own position in time. Don't think that death turns into life. Don't think that life turns into death. And this is impossible for us to understand in one sense, because we always are referencing life and death as a kind of loss or a gain. But he's asking us, just stop that. Stop thinking about it as a loss or a gain. And in that, you'll wake up to this receptivity. That's the word I'm using today, or Menzon teacher said, where. You'll break up to the where.
I see, because it's like, when, like, growing up, of course, you obviously think that your life is life and then you die.
Yeah.
But I always find that when you're trying to live, when you find that the only thing left is to think you're going to die, right? And then to understand differently now, moving in this area, I see like death now, there's a whole new relationship.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean in it? And it just,
this is a big part of people sometimes think Buddhism as being kind of negative, because we do tend to
well,
talk
it's like
about
a great
death.
thing. It's like
Yeah.
life, right?
Yeah.
It sounds morbid, right?
Yeah.
Right, but it's not. It's like it's like sparks a heart. Like it like makes me inspired, you know. Like, you know, to see.
So
that.
I would leave you with this, and then I have another question is, Kyogen Carlson Roshi, the founder, one of the co-founders of Dharma and Zen Center in Portland, and an important founder of our temple, when he was down giving a teaching once out at the Empty Field Zen Hermitage, Sado Martin's the teacher there, and I was there for the talk, and he was talking on life and death, and he said something very surprising to me, which has stuck with me, and I think it's just one of the truest things I've ever heard. He said, it's important to die well. And he said, the reason it's important to die well is not so that the people following you can die well. It's so they can live well. And hopefully they learn to die well too. But the way you learn to die well is to live well. And that connection, I think, is so important for us to keep in mind, because we just live until we die. Just live. And that's what dying well is called. And that's how we learn to live. So anyway, there's going to be a lot more discussion about this next week.
I've been thinking a lot about generosity recently, and that we have this one word, Dharma, that is relying on giving and relying on receiving. But we tend to separate those into two things, and the giving part we value, and the relying on receiving we devalue, almost vilify.
Yeah.
And what can we mean into exploring that non-duality?
Yeah, we should knock it off. You know, I mean, in a way, it's that simple. I mean, in the same way that, you know, tying your shoelaces is simple till you try to explain how to do it or learn how to do it. But I think the first thing is simply recognizing it, just as you're calling out to the assembly today. So when we talk about generosity, when we talk about it as a spiritual practice, we talk about it as a cultivation of heart, we will almost all of us immediately will think about, okay, how can I give to someone? Right? I think that's actually fine, right? That's a layer to it that we need to recognize, and then we can lean into what that giving is. But there's an other side to that. Dogen Zenji, in one of his teachings on Dharma, he says, although in truth nothing is our own, this should not keep us from sharing our strength with others. Right? Think about that. From Buddhist perspective, you don't own anything. Ultimately, it's not possible. There are no objects for you to own. there are only beings upon beings, and they can't be owned. We can pretend. And so he said, if that's the truth, that's the underlying principle of being. Everything is just free in itself. If that's true, then we should share. Should share our strength. We should share our resources. But notice that term share. Which direction is it? It's neither direction, right? So at first we're like, I have to reach beyond myself. And then we realize a deep appreciation. Everything I have been given to me. So leaning into that appreciation, not like just waiting for someone to give you something, but recognizing all the things that you're already given is a good way to lean in. When I was at the monastery, Daijoji Monastery, for the monastic training that I did, the Abbott there, Itabashi Zenji, it was great. I think maybe when I'm 60, I'll take up this practice. He would just scrawl things on pieces of paper and hang it up around the monastery, and you would like come across it. Like you'd be washing your teeth or brushing your teeth or washing your face, and you'd go and there'd be a little sign that said, shut the faucet of your mind. It was like very intense, you know. You're like getting up in the morning, you're kind of sleeping, and you'd look up and it would say, shut the faucet of your mind. Or the, in Japanese, it's kind of like, maybe you would even say the valve, like shut the valve of your heart or whatever, you know, just shut up, okay? You know, it was like that sort of thing. So, but one of my favorites, and it was up the whole time I was there, and I think he had hung it up quite a while ago and had just stayed there. It said, you were born naked. What are you complaining about? And I didn't take it in such a, you know, I'm sure sometimes you could take it in a very negative way. That could be kind of harsh thing. But for me, it really reminded me to think about like, oh, all of these, you know, like especially when his name was Golem, when he was the cook. Oh my God. Seaweed was never cut all the way through. And it was like pounds of MSG in the soup, and it's the poorly cooked rice, you know, it was so horrible. And, but, you know, after all, we were fed. So. Hi. Oh, yeah. We just changed course. That's the freedom of it all. Yeah.
And kind of it connected up for me.
Yeah.
The time we spent the last few weeks with the story.
Mm-hmm.
And the question just is, maybe you could help. What does it mean? What does it mean we do the physical act?
The physical act of bowing. Oh yeah, yeah. I once heard a teacher explain the physical act of bowing as pouring yourself clinging out of the top of your head. And I like that. You know, you go down. Whether it's a standing bow or is a full prostration, but the full prostration is a little bit easier to feel it because you're going all the way down. But it's like you could feel yourself clinging, just pour out of the top of your head. Now, really, the thing I like to point out about that is that you stand back up. A prostration is not just going down. A prostration is going down and coming up. A bow is to go down and to come up. And both are equally important. So in the pouring out the self-clinging, and we're doing this in meditation, we're doing this just in our moment-to-moment practice. And we say, I should pour out the self-clinging, all the ways in which I put myself at the center. I cling to something that I think of as a self and put it at the center, and have to create all these objects out there all the time to keep the self able to grasp something. So that process that I'm doing all the time, I'm trying to pour it out. But at the same time I pour it out, it doesn't mean that I disappear. It means that I appear in a different way. I appear as a partner, as an interdependent being with all of those things which I am with. And the Buddha is a great symbol of this. Is a living being, a personified being of this knowing. And so when we prostrate to the Buddha, it reminds us of that. But we don't actually have to wait for a carving of the Buddha or something like that to prostrate. That prostration is possible all the time. So you always see that in the story of the dragon girl. She comes and she bows to the Buddha, and then she stands to one side, and then she's not like, I disappeared. I'm ephemeral. She's like, hey, Shariputra, what are you talking about? And then she's got something to say.
I talk a little bit about this statue that we have on the altar of Prajnaparamita, and specifically, there's almost like a simplicity to her form that seems to stand in contrast with some of the other statues in iconography, and I guess it speaks to me in some way.
Yeah. So the Buddha's in the center, flanked by two ancestors, Ananda and Mahakashapa. I had mentioned Mahakashapa earlier, and that's in the center. And then to the Buddha's left, that's this side, that statue, Prajnaparamita, is known as the mother of the Buddhas, sometimes referred to as Buddha Eye, Buddha Mother. And our temple's name is Buddha Eye, and my teacher's name was Buddha Eye. But I would say, like one way I could say it is we got on her trail, but I think it's probably better to say that we just opened our eyes a little bit. We got a whiff of Prajnaparamita, maybe that would be the way to say it. Maybe 15 or 16 or 18 years, I don't remember really. And we started to talk about the way that Japanese Buddhist iconography was almost exclusively masculine. And not only iconography in the sense of what is like an icon, but also the icons that appear in stories. So all of the personifications, basically, whether they're in story or in sutra or in a physical form like an icon, almost all are male. And we start to work with that and say, well, this feels off to us. And through those conversations, which lasted some, I think over a year or so, we decided, the group of people at that time, that we would like to introduce another kind of veneration. And we had different choices of what that might be, and we settled on Prajnaparamita. And at that same time, a lot of the things that we were studying and the quality of our practice together was going more deeply into Prajnaparamita teachings and the six perfections and those kinds of things. So we decided on that, and then one of my friends, Charlie Picorni, who's a priest, at that time he was living just north of San Francisco in Sebastopol, and I was talking with him about it, and he said, oh, I know a carver. His name is Zoshi, and he's a Japanese man who had lived in the United States for a very long time, and he originally came here as a protester of nuclear armament. And he told this wonderful story when he brought this Prajnaparamita to us. We asked him, like, how did you get started carving? Because he's not classically trained. He's kind of self-trained, particularly for Buddhist carving, which is, there's like a very, articulated path that you would take if you were going to do that in Japan, and he hasn't gone through that path. And he said, well, I came here, I was a young person, I was against nuclear war, and so I came here to do a trek that started in, I believe it was in Los Angeles, and they walked all the way across the United States, and they ended up in Washington, D.C., and then they went past these test sites and things. And he said that he had an opportunity at one of the places where they were protesting. He actually saw a missile, and I don't know how it is that happened exactly, but he saw the missile, and he said to himself, this is the shape of our heart when we're in hell. And when he saw the missile, that's what he saw. He was like, this is the shape. If we are in hell, this is the shape that we will make. And he said at that point, he picked up a piece of wood and he started to carve it. And then as they walked across the United States, he said by the time he got to Washington, D.C., he had carved a Buddha. And he grew up in Japan, and he had that imagery in his mind. And that's when he became a carver, and he started to carve. So I met with him, asked him if he would carve the image, and he did, and it took a while, maybe a year or so, and then he brought it up on the train, and I picked him up, and it was all wrapped, she was all wrapped in cloth, And while I was driving, picking up the train, and we were coming back here to Budai, and I said, this is so great. I'm so glad you've done this. He said, well, you haven't even seen it yet. Blah 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 blah. And then I said, I have lots of priest friends. If you want to carve more Buddhas, I think I could drum up business for you or whatever. And he said to me, people who carve Buddhas do not live long. And then he proceeded to tell me he was kind of an intense person, like a really amazing guy. And he said, as soon as I begin to carve a piece that's a Buddha, not like a more like whimsical piece, but something that's an icon, he said, I'm never more than 10 feet away from it for the whole process. So he said every night, I would take her and put her at the head of my bed and sleep, and get up in the morning and take her. And so he said it's like birthing something. And he said, so for those 3 months he was carving her, they were just together all the time. And he chose madrone, which if you're a woodworker,
Oh my God.
madrone is the hardest possible thing that you could choose, but it's a very local tree from the area that he was. We have a little madrone up here, but a lot of madrone down there. And then he carved it and brought it here, and then we saw it, and then we did the proper ceremonies to install it as an icon, etc. So that's kind of the story of how the particular icon came to us. The Prajnaparamita is this icon is very common in Vajrayana lineages, tantric lineages in Tibet. And so you see lots of Prajnaparamita imagery and iconography. But as Buddhism traveled in China and then into Japan, the iconography became much more male, with some exceptions to that. It was also earlier than the tantric, and within that society, layered with all kinds of patriarchy, one of the ways that the society functions is anything that is feminine is implicit, and anything that is masculine is explicit. And that has some real power. There's like, people think, oh, there's no femininity in Japanese Buddhism. There's tons of femininity in Japanese Buddhism, but it's always implicit. But that's a problem, right? It has some wonderful sides, but it also has a problem. And so, so if I show this icon to priests in Japan, my teacher including, he just like couldn't even accept it. He was just like, you're wrong. He's like, there's no such thing. I was like, Master, here in the Prajnaparamita, where it refers to it as the mother, which is also your last name in the Dharma, da, 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 da. And he just couldn't hear. So this also why we have lineage, because then, we die and your students take over, and then they push things all along a little bit, So anyway, in my view, we're at a time where it's not just a simple operation of saying, okay, we need to get more women iconography in here, so let's just put something up because we need that. Some people approach it that way, and I think there's an argument for that, but I think there's a much deeper exploration that is in our tradition, but again, all in these implicit places. And how do we bring that into visibility, but without making it masculine, which is so easy to do. You can simply say, let's take what is classically feminine and then let's make it really explicit. And in that process, you kind of form it in a different way, and you don't appreciate the depth that was there in its implicit manifestation. That's almost oxymoronic to say implicit manifestation, and so I feel like our work here at Buddha Eye, one of our deep works is figuring out how to go through that process. And if it took Zoshi Sensei 3 months, not being apart from the statue of Prajnaparamita, I think we 3 decades of not being apart from Prajnaparamita is our work, and we've come a long way in those 15 years or so. So yeah, so I'm not sure if that's exactly like what you were asking, but that's about maybe 5% of what I could say. So let's go here and then we'll come back.
You mentioned talk that Zen is a religion. It's not a religion in my mind, because a religion, you have a God. And the Buddha wasn't a god. As a matter of fact, there's a story about him dying. And he was a wise person. And he essentially what he said was that, at least to me, life is suffering. And what you got to do is you got to meditate. And meditation was around before him. He didn't invent it.
Yeah.
And treat other people as yourself. And so therefore, it's not a religion. And
So-
the reason I came, religion has a God in it.
That you and I have a long-standing disagreement about this. And I don't want to cede religion to theists. So that's kind of technical language, but what I'm saying is I don't want to give up the word religion to people who center their religion on God or gods. Because I believe that the human heart really needs what it is that we, in a general sense, call religion. And so I want to claim religion, Buddhism as a religion, because I think we need that general approach of religion. We need community, we need investment in each other, we need investment in deep parts of our heart and mind. We need ability to like imagine things that are beyond what we've even thought of up until now. We need stories that help us do that. And so all of those things are classically what's part of religion. And I know that, you know, we went through periods of very dogmatic, continue to go through periods of very dogmatic religious perspectives. And I don't want to be that kind of religious, but I think we still need religion. So I choose very specifically to use the word religion because I want to reclaim or keep that in our place. But for people who are really like, look, I'm just allergic to religion, usually my response is, no problem. You know, in a way, in a sense, Buddhism isn't a religion. So why don't you try it out and then see? And then usually, you know, people have to struggle with these stories that are very fantastical and those kinds of things, and that can unfold. But you know, for it to be really religion, it can't be religion. And for it really to not be religion, I think it has to be religion. So that's very Zen kind of way.
What bothers me is that somehow the Buddhist followers seem to be immortal, especially in the sutras, and they appear. And how do you have that?
Well, you know, things can appear in a lot of different ways. You know, Prajnaparamita appears to me regularly. And you know, I don't feel like I'm going to reach out and pinch her, although sometimes she reaches out and pinches me. And so how do we give voice to these encounters that we have that they don't live so much on the material plane, that we're very transfixed by the material. And so I want to make room for things that are not just located in the material. And if we think of those as being psychological, or we think of those as being, you know, part of our brain chemistry or whatever, that's one way to go at it. I don't think it fits in that box so neatly, but I'm not too concerned about it. So that's why I think those stories are important. You know, sometimes those stories are a problem because they teach people to project themselves into a kind of fantasy world in which they don't pay attention to the embodied material side of their life, right? So that's a problem. But the other is a problem too, where we ignore the things that are beyond the material and we just try to reduce everything to the material. And so both directions I'd say is a problem. So I think we will continue to have this disagreement. And it's one of the things that I love about us being in long-term relationship, is that's a great teaching to everybody here. That, you know, people, you know, when Tenkan's going to ask the question, if you've been here for a long time, that's probably going to be part of what's in it, because you're invested in it. And I mean that in a really, I mean that in a serious way, that's your investment in your own exploration. And everyone should, if you don't have that kind of stubbornness, sorry, Tankan, then you won't actually get very far. You got to take what you believe to be true and believe in it, and then take the next step and take the next step. And you do that all the time. I mean, all the awakenings you had while we studied the Lotus Sutra, which I have to remind you about these days when you say you don't like the Lotus Sutra. But you know, your heart was just popping all over the place.
I'm told them not to ask the question.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons why it's good to have a lifelong partner. Yes.
I've been ruminating on this phrase that a yoga teacher of mine said, which is, we're only as enlightened as the company we keep. And it does ring true for me. And on first glance, that sounds really nice. But then when I delve a little deeper, I feel like there's elements of separateness and isolation and condescension. So I guess my question is, how does that relate to Buddhism, or what would you have to say about that?
We have a similar teaching in Buddhism that is a teaching about keeping good friends. Yeah, that you should have good friends. And there's one, so I think you're already going through this process, and this I think is an important process. The first layer is we can take the teaching in a very conventional way. Like, look, if you're hanging out with a bunch of people who are like mean to each other and mean to others and self-centered and all those kind of things, you're unlikely to be able to progress very much. It's going to be hard to shake that off when you're in a cultural framework in which that's getting like repeated over and over and over again. So you might want to jump ship and hang out with some cooler folks. Like, so that's one level, which is really important. And a lot of times that's what people need. They need to hear that. Like, look, your friends are losers and you need to hang out with some different people. But there's a dark side to that, which is your friends are losers, just like you say, condescension, isolation, cutting off, all of those mistakes appear when we kind of turn our heart towards purity, you know, like I'm gonna become pure in some way, and these people are impure. And so I think there's another layer, which is how is it that the company we keep is made good? Or how is it the company we keep is seen as good? Or what is my capacity or responsibility to see others in their goodness? That's another layer. Like, even, you know, maybe you have a friend that's drunk all the time. You know, oftentimes people who are drunk all the time have some really deep wisdom. And it's part of the reason they're drunk all the time. It's they haven't learned how to integrate it. They've seen something that other people haven't seen. That's not always true. Sometimes they're just drunk. But oftentimes there's something you've seen and you don't know what to do with it. And so you're medicating. You know, and sometimes that medication is just medication of pain, but oftentimes pain is really the center of where the clear seeing is, but you can't quite face it. So how would you see that in someone? It doesn't mean you have to take up the same habit that they do, but maybe there's something really good about such a person. And how do we have enough stability in ourselves to not just fall into the kind of trappings of the thing, but to see the truth of that person's wisdom? So it's a little bit different way that we might go about it. And then as our own, you know, but if we don't have our own feet underneath us or our own hips underneath us, that's very hard to do. So the first stage is important. Like, I got to get my hips underneath me. And as my hips are underneath me, then I can start working on that other side. And then from there, you know, to me, then it almost becomes kind of like a joke. Not joke, maybe too strong of a word, but it's like we're only as good as the company we keep. It's like
There's an irony there, maybe?
yeah, like an irony and a kind of like an invitation to living in a different way. Like, how am I dividing the company I keep? Who could be part of the company I keep? And who could be not part of the company I keep? Who's included? Where's the line? How many videos have I watched in the past 3 or 4 weeks about the possibility of Trump actually going to jail? A whole bunch, just a little hint. I mean, I don't feel good about it, but I see it and I'm like, oh yeah, this could really happen. I get kind of excited and I watch the video. Are those people my company? Is Trump my company? You know, I don't really know. You know, showing my political color there a little bit. I think. But anyway, so that's what I mean by the joke a little bit. It's like, who gets included? Are the people who I've decided to call my friends the ones that are included? Or is it all of humanity? Or is it all of beingness? What company could be outside? None. And so now I have this other kind of responsibility than just sorting through folks and figuring out which ones are good for me and which ones are bad for me. But if we go to that place to begin with, it's really easy to just stay in alcohol. Yeah. Okay, last one.
My heart is so full after listening to you talk. I went to my two now.
Oh, well, we're going to have some very tasty treats. And the Ember was telling me that they're really amazing because they look crunchy, but they're actually creamy. And, you know, if you just remember the peach, then I don't know there's enough for everyone, but then there's some cookies that look crunchy that I think are crunchy. And then some other things too. So that's kind of, you know, Zen joke, right? And I would say, you know, it's not so complicated. And you know what it is to live from that full heart. So just keep it going, and then you'll forget about it, and then remember. And have a peach.